when you're out on a wild river or a forest or sailing open water with no clear plan or sitting alone in a cave, sitting with nothing but a headlamp. Something in that moment in your mind goes quiet in a way that it almost never does in ordinary life. The noise almost stops and the to do list disappears. And today we are talking about what adventure does to a mind that needs space to breathe, and how one writer who has spent his life chasing those moments and then turning them into stories the rest of us get to live through on the page. Welcome back to another episode of Healthy Mind, Healthy Life, the show where we have honest and practical conversations like these. My name is Sayan, as some of you would know, and my guest today is Rick Glaze. He's an adventure novelist, award-winning songwriter, Stanford Creative Writing Program alumnus, and Vanderbilt graduate whose books including The Purple River, Spanish Pieces of Eight, Ralph and Murray, and his latest 8 Pieces of Eight are rooted in the real rivers, oceans, and wild places that he has actually explored himself. So, Rick, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here with me. And I think, oof, that's a lot of creative stuff right there. So it's an honor to have you here with me.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Just hearing you say it wears me out, seems like a lot, but it's been all fun things.
Yeah, I totally feel it. So, Rick, before we start with this, a little disclaimer for all the listeners. Some statements may reflect personal belief and experiences and are presented as individual views and not medical advice. Listeners should please consult qualified professionals or medical conditions. So, Rick, I really want to start with something that sits on that human edge before we get into writing, which is you have kayaked wild rivers, okay, sailed the Caribbean, and even gone diving for centuries old shipwrecks. Now, that is something that I think most people really dream about, doing all those wild stuff, and you actually did it. So, what was it that first pulled you towards that kind of experience? Was it curiosity, something that you would naturally lean off towards, or was it restlessness on the other side, or something else that you would like to share?
Well, I think it might be something like restlessness. I had a regular career, which required me to be home, and I had children and responsibilities. But when we go on a vacation, a lot of people would want to go to Hawaii or Florida or some beach and just relax and sit there. And I certainly enjoy that. But my trips, I just tended to want to do different kinds of things. And I like to be outdoors, and that seemed like the right thing to do. When I wrote a lot of these books, I was living in California. And of course, the weather out there, they typically don't have winter. And so you can stay busy a lot of the time. But irregardless of that, I just like to be out. I like to have different adventures. And most importantly, I like to learn new things and to be involved in new things. The fun thing about it was when I started doing those things and I decided to write books about it, I was coming from a beginner. I was just learning to kayak, and so I felt like I could really lay it down in the book about how to get started and the excitement of it. And so it wasn't old hat to me. It was brand new and exciting, and it made for a fun book to write.
Beautiful. I love it. And something, Rick, that is shared in there, and I just, out of curiosity, want to ask you that, from the way you narrated that, I'm sure you're more of a spontaneous kind of a person. So when you're really traveling somewhere, right? And this is a little off topic, but I would, like to touch upon this, is that I hear people, plan out stuff, like we're going to go here, and from there we're going to go here, and, we're going to get a hotel by the beach or whatever it is, right? And, plan out stuff. But out of curiosity, I just want to ask you, right, from whatever traveling that you have done, do you think traveling without a plan leads to more of a creative version of yourself, or is it something that really is hidden in that spontaneity of what a person or individual discovers when he or she goes out on, let's say, an unplanned trip, or an unexplored place? What would you like to share?
Well, I hear what you're saying about planning versus spontaneity. And,
Yeah.
really the spontaneity is a lot of what this is about. However, I have to say that, I've lived a fairly good long life, and I know that if it's too much spontaneity, you're going to be sitting in the corner reading, twiddling your thumbs or reading the paper. So there has to be a certain amount of structure in
Mm,
these adventures. And and I think that the idea that everything's totally spontaneous is not what it's about. What it's really about is having an adventure that has a plan and you know what you're doing, but the adventure itself is brand new. And of course the people you're with they're either new people or they're people you already know that they have their own separate experience on these kind of wild or exciting trips and you see different parts of those people
okay.
and that's an important thing because characters in my stories are really the crux of the stories. They take place
Beautiful.
on a river or sailing in the ocean or in a deep dark cave, but that's the setting, but they're really about the people and I enjoy seeing how people interact in those types of different environments.
Yeah, that's well said, I think. And I think that's such an honest way to really put it. And I think that really speaks a lot to our listeners today who are listening to this right now. And now I want to talk about your experiences. And since you said that, there should be some degree of structure, but I want to go back to your story when you were learning to kayak wild rivers that you had never run before. I mean, there must have been moments of fear, fear, like real uncertainty, right? So how did you really handle that internally? And looking back, what did those moments teach you about yourself that you couldn't have learned anywhere else?
Well, I think that I mean I was kayaking down some of these rivers in Oregon and California and Idaho, and I didn't know a lot about it, but my friend who I had worked with in the past, we did a lot of activities, and he'd come up with these river trips, and I'd say, "Well, I guess I'll go." And we'd take off down those rivers, and everything would be new. But I can remember back though in those days, I was excited about the new. And if there's a rapid I hadn't run before, I said, "Well, good, let's just hit it." And when we had guides, and they would say, "Come in on the left of this rapid, and then after the first curl, move to the right, and then eddy out on the side, and you do that stuff." And so you'd know what you're supposed to do, and but doing it because it didn't always work out. Sometimes when you paddle right, a wave would hit you and you'd pop the other way and you could get into trouble. What was fun about it is that I could write about those adventures of getting into trouble. Well, funny story is after I wrote The Purple River, I sent copies to the guides. They lived in Oregon and they had a shop there and they sold them there in their store. But I told him, I said, when we went down the Salmon River in Idaho, the middle fork joined the main fork at one point, and I made up this story about how the middle fork was was overrun, and it was a big wall of water, and it was a flood, and it was flooding everybody out. And I said, I know that didn't happen, and so I made it up. And they said, "Oh yeah, it happened the year after you were there. It happened just like your book." So, those are fun kind of things that you could kind of extrapolate is what I say, They it didn't happen to me, but it could have happened, and I write it into the book with the characters. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, you're spot on with that. I think there's something, about learning a brand new skill, kayaking, for example, in a demanding environment and at any age, at any point of time, because I think, that really matters beyond the activity itself. And, the idea, Rick, that I would say, there's something really important that, I mean, in the idea that novelty and challenge, even when uncomfortable, I mean, these are the things that are actually good for us, right? It's the opposite of what our anxious mind in our daily lives tell us. So, which brings me to this creative side of all of this that you, like you said, didn't go on these adventures. You actually came back and wrote about those experiences, the Purple River, Spanish Pieces of Eight, your upcoming Tennessee Cave novel, these I think all came directly out of your lived experience. So for you personally, what does the act of writing do that experience alone doesn't? Is there something about putting it into a story that processes it differently, or something that you would like to share?
It's one of the biggest joys that I have. There are a lot of joys in life, and I've enjoyed a lot of things. But sitting down and writing a book, and let me give you the idea that when you're writing a book, a novel like that, you are making up the world. Now you don't make up, I didn't make up the river. It was there. And I didn't make up the fact you have to paddle with a sweep stroke or a J stroke and to get down that river. I didn't make that part up. But what happens on that river and what happens with the people is my world, and I make it up. And if I want to have a real pretty girl fall in love with the narrator, and then I can do that. Or if I want to have somebody fall off a cliff and bust their head open, I can do that. Or I can do any of that. And so the creativity of it is very fun.
Endless.
Yeah, and the thing is, what's really fun, I found out in the first few books I wrote, was that I would say, okay, I know I'm going to get from here to there in the story, and I know these people are going to do this, but I didn't know exactly how they would do it. But I thought they would, I start writing, I think I thought they would do this, but it turns out when this character said this other character said something that I didn't think he was going to say, but he had to, because that's who he was. He's got his own, he makes his own life. And so it turns out the story goes a little different way than I was thinking, because these characters say what they're going to say. And that you just get a smile on your face. You said, this is so fun. I own this world, and it's got a life of its own. So, everybody might not identify with that, but a lot of people that read a lot of novels, they enjoy that kind of spontaneity in the characters. And I think you feel it in my characters. I think they're real life people, and I respect each one of them for who they are. That may sound funny, but that's what I do.
Well, I think, yeah, what you're describing here is really something that's universal. That creativity in whatever form it takes gives us somewhere to put things in perspective. A place to really sit down and jot down the emotion that has nowhere else to go, right? And the form that it takes is often beautiful than not. So if someone listening to this, Rick, right now has never done anything like you've described, never kayaked a river, never sailed open water, never sat down to write anything longer than a work email maybe. So, I mean, but something in this conversation that probably stirs something in them. So where do they start? Was the smallest and most perhaps the accessible version of what you're talking about would be realistic to them? What would you like to invite them to?
Well, you mean as far as being a reader goes?
Yeah, of course. Adventure, I mean, not just the reading part of it, the whole creative process, and maybe a person where he finds comfort and how does he, jot down his emotions and, relate to the stories that we are talking about today. So what would you really invite them to think about?
Well, I think that as a reader, let me see if I got my train of thought here. Yeah, I don't have my train of thought.
Okay, let me rephrase this. So for someone who feels like, they have lost their sense of adventure, maybe life got, way too busy, got heavy. What would you say to them about whether it's too late to find it again?
I think it's not too late. I think if you read, for example, Spanish Pieces of Eight, a lot of reviewers have said that, it's a fun story about this family and greed and this treasure they're finding and sailing in the Virgin Islands and other places. But they said, but this book is really about the outdoors, and it's about being in those places. And if you haven't, one of them said, if you haven't been to the Virgin Islands, you'll want to go. And if you have been, you'll want to go back when you read Spanish Pieces of Eight. And so I think that somebody that would like to get going on some adventure, take a look at Spanish Pieces of Eight, Eight Pieces of Eight, and and get a feel for what these outdoors adventures are about, and think about where you might like to go. I can tell you this, that one person who edited Spanish Pieces of Eight did one of the edits on it. She got together with her husband and they went to the Virgin Islands and went to every port and every marina that was in the book. And of course, it
Wow.
bounces from one to another to about 15 of them. They went to every one in order, just like it was in the book, because they were compelled because it sounded like a place they would like. And so I'd love to see more people doing that. I think they would get a big kick out of it.
Yeah, definitely. And on the other hand, you also wrote Ralph and the Murray during the pandemic, which is very different. It has this warm, funny story about two boys in a southern small town narrated by a dog and a cat. So I think that's a very different gear from these kind of Caribbean treasure hunts or from the whitewater rapids. So what did that particular project give you during what was an incredibly difficult time for most people? And what was the mental health value of that story for you as the person writing it?
It was a real fun story. It was a pandemic book. I had planned a different kind of memoir type thing and have to do with my moving to California. And I was going to do it with interviews. And I'm sorry, I'm outside in the porch. This bird is real loud. I hope it's okay. But I was going to do interviews in California. And so I lined up several interviews and I was going to get started, and the pandemic hit. And nobody wanted to fly. Nobody wanted to meet with an interview.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it was really scary. And as you remember, and so I stayed home, and my wife said, "Well, why don't you just write that book with the dog and the cat telling the story?" And of course, I said, "Well, you can't write a dog and a cat telling the story." So the next morning, I woke up and I thought, "I'm going to write that with the dog and the cat telling the story." So I did, and it's a really fun book. I laughed all the way through writing it because I just couldn't believe how the dog and the cat were narrating this little story. We marketed that as an adult book, but I think it's more of a middle grade kind of younger person's book because it's got two 10-year-old boys and a dog and a cat in it. I mean, those are good characters. In fact, I'm writing the next Ralph and Murray book right now, and we're in the editing process, and it's going to be a really fun book. But I enjoyed it. It's set in my hometown where I grew up, a small little town outside Nashville, and I enjoyed doing the research on it. I went back and looked at life. It takes place in 1959, and these are times when Elvis Presley was the big thing, and they had things like Chubby Checker and the Twist. These were big things, and so this was in 1959, and those things are backdrops for the setting for Ralph and Murray. So it was a lot of fun. It's a small, short book, but it got very great reviews, and it was Book of the Month for Kirkus Reviews and so forth. So I think people like reading it. I don't think you can read it without laughing out loud. So
That's great to hear. That's great to hear, Rick. And, completely a different take from the other two books that you mentioned. And I think, that is exactly the kind of reframe or answer that I was hoping for, because I think too often that we treat adventure or life as something that adventure in itself as something that we have or, we don't. We often think that it's very late and but it turns out that it's not, rather, right? And what you're describing right now sounds more like a choice, rather. It's something that you keep making on and again and again. So let's bring this home. Rick, for somebody who resonated with this part of the conversation or the whole, perhaps. So where can they find your books, and what's the best place for them to connect with you at?
I'd be really excited if people like this interview and like what they heard, and they visited my website at rickglaze.com. There's short descriptions of all the books. There's ways to look at them on Amazon. Several of them are audio books, and they're all Kindle books. and paperback. So there's ways to enjoy these books. And if they go to rickglaze.com, they'll get introduced. Now, I'll tell you this too. If you go on the website, you can click for a free brochure that I wrote, a short 5-page brochure about the Virgin Islands. And that will introduce you to my advanced readers group. And you could try that out if people would like to. Love to have people join me there.
Perfect. I think that would really help, Rick. So what I'll do is I'll include the details in the show notes so that people can easily reach out to your website and discover your books, which is The Purple River, Spanish Pieces of Eight, Ralph and Murray, 8 Pieces of Eight, and also your upcoming novel as well. So folks, we come to the minute mark of this conversation, but really what I'm carrying forth from this conversation, and I also want you to maybe sit down and think about is, something simple and a little uncomfortable is that the human mind doesn't really grow in comfort zones. Right? Sometimes it needs that little push. And I think the story that you tell yourself about that experience really matters just as much the experience itself. So that's what I would like to share for today's episode, folks. And Rick, thanks to you, I think you brought this very engaging conversation, put so much life and color into the conversation as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. To everyone listening, I hope today did remind you that taking care of your mind doesn't always look like sitting still, right? Sometimes it looks like getting on a wild journey, and sometimes it also looks like writing a story down. So with that, folks, this has been Healthy Mind, Healthy Life. I'm your host, Sayan, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you. Bye.